everybody, and welcome back to Pantsuits and Lawsuits, your favorite podcast to learn about the latest developments in American law. I'm your host today, Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, and today's episode is all about data centers. The infrastructure required to power AI and all the tools you might have noticed becoming more prominent in your workspace and in your life, and just fun videos that might be in your feed, whether you like it or not. We're excited for this episode to talk to some real experts and to sort of get to the bottom of what's happening as it pertains to data centers in our states. Welcoming to the podcast, Karen Potter. Karen, you are an environmental and energy specialist at the Arizona AG's office. And I'm sorry that your boss couldn't be here today, but we are delighted to have you on to explain some things about data centers and how they can be a strain on natural resources, drive up energy costs, which we know has certainly happened, and raises some legitimate sustainability concerns, especially for communities that are already facing affordability and climate pressures. So we're excited to talk about this topic because it's on everybody's mind right now. And if I could just let you know, we right now have nearly 20 data centers that are pending in communities around the state. And it's a source of great concern. And I will say this one thing about it. This is very bipartisan in nature, this concern. This is not a Democratic concern, a Republican concern. This crosses the spectrum in ways that you rarely see with an issue. So, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in Arizona and what your views are from your work, just generally on a national scale as it pertains to data centers.
Yeah, certainly. And thank you, AG Nessel. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I'm just glad we could have this conversation.
When you go back to and talk to your boss, just say it was amazing how much funnier AG Nessel is than you are. And just see what her response is. Just see how it goes.
I'm sure she'll love that. So absolutely. That's great. So in my role, maybe I can start with, so in the AG's office in Arizona, I focus predominantly on, energy, kind of the nexus between energy policy and energy law and how those things, work with one another, especially as it relates to utility regulation. And apologies for a moment, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Still hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Sorry about that.
Right.
So in my role, I focus predominantly on issues in the regional level, federal level, sometimes, commenting on regulatory matters, but broadly focusing on what's happening within the, energy regulatory space at the state level. And that is predominantly through our version of the PUC. In Arizona, we have what's called a constitutional utility commission called the Arizona Corporation Commission, which means the authority of the commission is vested by our Constitution, and they have a plenary authority to do things such as rate making and energy policy and a kind of a broad array of issues that maybe otherwise in other states you would have to go to the legislature to get approval on beforehand.
Yes, and if I'm not mistaken, that was AG May's foray into the political sphere was working in this space, was it not?
Exactly, yes. So AG May's, worked for a long time. She was the chairman of the Arizona Corporation Commission. She helped champion multiple, priorities and issues at the time, everything from helping to make energy more affordable through access to energy efficiency and programs that help to make homes more comfortable for customers, while also helping to kind of enable and jumpstart the renewable energy market and, other activities that were not getting, that were, could have been assisted from different types of policies at the state level. And both of those were huge successes, I think, in large part from then Chairman Mays, now, of course, AG Mays. So in Arizona, I think you're kind of seeing a kind of a convergence of many of these issues at once. And I like to kind of open this up with kind of addressing, I think, the affordability issues that are happening nationwide, but I think there's kind of an interesting layer that's developing in Arizona. So, there's a couple of key pressure points that have happened that are that help to explain why we're seeing such massive surge of data center requests. And, we're having all these conversations now about halting retirement of assets that are no longer useful, or assets that large scale, the ancient fossil fuel plants that are not helping to serve kind of the needs of customers today, and that don't have the flexibility that we need for the grid. Because what we're seeing now with energy usage over time, there's a lot of changes, there's a lot of variability, and that's just not in line with some of these older technologies, and it's not in line with the needs of customers today as well. And also they're not economic, so there's just that. So you kind of have these kind of key pressure points kind of converging at this moment, where we're seeing this explosion in new data center construction and requests for data centers. So ultimately, there's in the last 5 years, there's been rapid growth of data center industries that have, and I think I would describe this as almost shining a light on problems that the electric grid has already been struggling with for many years. It just happened to be that, prices were stable enough in the past that I think the broad kind of, broad array of consumers across the country have not really noticed a change, but now they're noticing a change, right? And they're noticing it in a dramatic way. So first, things like grid resilience, we're seeing these stresses on the system from extreme weather, wildfires, natural disasters, and that it has a heavy toll on our utility system, because that's going to mean utilities need better outage automation systems that can isolate those problems. They need more focus on storm hardening. So that's going to be a bigger, kind of pressure point. Also, for many parts of our country, the grid infrastructure is aging. In many cases, utilities that are regulated, right, are actually, sometimes discouraged because of their financial structure.
Can you tell us why people are so concerned about having their energy rates rise as a result of the data centers? And do we really have enough in terms of the infrastructure that's out there right now? There's a lot of concerns. How are we going to keep the power, on at all if we have these kinds of needs that are going up by substantial amounts? I mean, from year to year, just because of these proposed data centers. I will tell you that we have just one data center in Michigan where it's believed that it would be the same for this 1.4 gigawatt data center as powering 1 million homes. And that's
Right.
just been approved. How can we sustain this with our current grid as we have it right now, and as you've indicated, is aging rapidly?
Right. I mean, I think that's the important question that everyone is talking about. And there's a lot of different solutions for the technology piece, right, that help with demand flexibility. But before we even get there, the major issue that needs to be discussed, both at the state and the regional and federal level, is the potential gamemanship of the interconnection queues at the statewide level for utilities. Because what's happening right now is you have a lot of different potential investors in data centers, maybe commercial real estate developers or brokers, or maybe even the cloud technology, large hyperscale AI facilities themselves who want to get into the queue. And all of them are trying to essentially establish a place in line so that they can get a guaranteed electricity contract with the utility. And it's often a very low or minimal bar for anyone who wants to get into this queue for them to overcome to get a spot. They can trade places in these spots sometimes, and there's a lot of potential ways to game the system so that they can get farther in the queue so they can get a guaranteed contract. Oftentimes, these are what we refer to as speculative proposals that are coming in. And it's very challenging for utilities often to understand which contracts are legitimate or which proposals are real or not. So you often have to do multiple, collateral requirements, if you will, or, minimum contract requirements to understand like what's a legitimate project or not, and to see if they're hitting milestones, to see if
What,
that's
Karen,
right.
what kind of collateral requirements? Could you expand on that a little?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a couple of things that some states have done as a part of like large load tariffs, for example. They have put, minimum, amount of power upfront, payments that they have to make
Okay,
for this.
just let's set that aside. Okay, minimum load tariffs. No one knows what that means. What is that?
Yeah, so a large load tariff is specifically let's call it a plan. All customers are on a utility rate plan. That's how they get service from their utility. And large customers, like large industrial customers, think the Amazons, Googles, Metas of the world, they have to typically enroll in some type of rate plan in order to execute service with a utility. And there are certain requirements that are attached to these rate plans. So one thing is minimum requirements for payment. So this means that irrespective of how much power their facilities consume, they have to make certain upfront payments.
Okay, so
So
what would you do? I'm sorry to interrupt, but like, would you take that money and say you have to put X number of millions of dollars or even to the billions of dollars into escrow so that we know that if we are creating new infrastructure, specifically in order to power this massive data center, we know for sure that OpenAI or Oracle or Amazon or Microsoft is paying for it, and it's not going to be left up to the ratepayers in order to shoulder that burden. Is that what you're saying?
exactly, that's referred to as a collateral requirement in a lot of these deals. One of the
Is that
biggest issues.
I'm sorry, I mean, I just, but do you have that in Arizona? Do you require that in Arizona?
So right now, that is something that's being proposed, and there's a lot of different types of agreements that are happening, or different recommendations. But a standardized process has not been solidified yet, and that was what I was going to say as one of the number one things that states can do to help to curtail a potential disaster when it comes to energy affordability in their state is have a dedicated process for these types of large industrial energy contracts to go through a tariff, because one of the challenges is if you have these kind of secret deals where the price for power is being set with negotiators in a separate room and not in a public setting through a public utility commission, then you're running into issues of potential cost subsidization where maybe residential customers might be subsidizing these big data centers.
Right.
And that's the risk here.
Sure. And Karen, let me ask you this, okay? So I'm trying to understand like the differences between Arizona and Michigan. In Michigan, what we're seeing are secret contracts. So that is that we are not having public hearings about this. We are having contracts that are heavily redacted. They get approved by our Public Service Commission, and that the public is never able to see, and that our department is never able to see. Is that allowed in Arizona, or is it just in Michigan we're doing that?
Well, right now, I mean that's an issue we're looking at right now. We requested the Arizona Corporation Commission to vacate a decision it recently made on a soon-to-be data center facility. Whereas, this contract that they had was outside of a process where they had a public hearing and people had a real chance to ask questions on the project or facility. And so that creates a lot of secrecy, right? And that's kind of the issue. So that's something that we asked them to vacate that order, and we asked them to create a process where all large industrial users have to have some transparency. They have to have a public process where the rate of the electricity that they're going to use has to be public and universally accessible. And that's the issue here, right? We're not saying don't power facilities, but do it in a way that's in public view so that the risk of subsidizing these facilities goes away, right? So that's the big issue. And I think that's a commonality between Arizona and Michigan, where states that don't have a standardized process yet for these large loads, you're seeing potentially bad actors or people that see an opportunity to go to other states that maybe don't have a process up and running yet to maybe get guaranteed deals on the table
So
before.
they're taking advantage of us because we haven't done enough to set the ground rules for how this is going to work. And so they're bursting into our states and trying to sort of, run over everybody in getting these done as quickly as possible. without us knowing what impact it's going to have on our states in the future. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I think there's a major risk there, right? And I think what we need to do is at the state level and even local governments too, right? Because there's an interplay here with things like, the taxes that these facilities are going to provide, or versus the incentives that maybe the state may provide for data centers. There needs to be a real conversation around how are we going to ensure that our citizens are actually getting something out of these deals to ensure that this is not a potentially like parasitic transaction, right? With that's at the
parasitic transaction. I'm going to write that down and I'm going to use that over and over again, but I will give you no credit for it, Karen.
Okay, yeah.
I'm
That's I'm just the messenger, right? I'm just the messenger. And we want to do right, like the goal of this work for setting up right policies is to establish the rules of the game that allow for facilities to come online, but in a way that is not going to create rolling brownouts or issues with our grid reliability, is not going to exacerbate issues related to extreme heat or weather, natural disasters, and it's not going to be at the expense of taxpayers and ratepayers. Right? Because at the end of the day, ratepayers are taxpayers and vice versa.
So Karen, let me ask you this. Does Arizona have tax incentives for data centers?
We do. So there is a tax incentive that's being discussed right now on the equipment and other pieces. It was put together in the 2000s under a very different time period, and obviously a lot has changed, and that's the big difference of what we're seeing with data centers today, right? Data centers from back in the day, that was typically referred to like maybe a room with a couple of server racks. That was the data center for a company, right? And now with AI, I would refer to it as the AI gold rush, has completely changed the name of the game. I have one statistic for you. A huge portion of energy for these data centers, up to 40%, is used purely to run massive cooling systems, right? That prevent equipment from overheating or being damaged.
Wow.
Just for
Karen, what about my idea? I proposed this to AG Mays, is that in the winter, everyone from Michigan just goes to Arizona, moves there for several months. Then in the summer, all the Arizonans, Arizonaganders go from Arizona to Michigan. Like problem solved practically, right? This way, nobody freezes to death, but nobody, overheats either. So is that a practical solution that you see happening? Because, I really wish I was in Sedona right now and not in the Detroit area. No disrespect to my beautiful, beautiful state, but it has been, a winter weather advisory for like 3 months and negative 15.
I personally would sign up for that exchange. I don't know if we could convince all the millions of people in Arizona, but dare to dream, right?
What's worse, to have it be negative 15 outside or to have it be 120? Like if you had to choose, which would you go with?
I would say this, you can always put on more layers of clothing, but you can only, remove so much and feel comfortable, right? When it comes to, to the heat. So probably
Karen, what you're saying is Michigan is better than Arizona, is what I heard in that response.
I didn't say that, but I'll say I do.
Thank you. That's all the time we have. So we're going to have to move on. But you know what, Karen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your thoughts with us. We really appreciate it. And I hope we'll get to meet up again sometime soon. Hopefully me going to Arizona in the near future, if it continues to be incredibly freezing here, because I just can't with this anymore. I'm too old, but
I really understand. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Welcome to the podcast, Michael Moody, who is the division chief of the Special Litigation Division at the Michigan Department of Attorney General. And Mike, you've had that job since early 1900s, approximately?
1995.
Yes, 1995 you've been with the office. And a lot of people wonder probably what special litigation is, but can you explain to them a little bit about what you do at our department?
Sure. The Special Litigation Division, so the name doesn't make it easy for people to know, does handle utility consumer advocacy. It's a name that we had way back in the Frank Kelly era, and we've kept ever since. But yeah, we handle cases that are filed at the Public Service Commission. So think your rate cases and stuff like that that affects your energy bills. We'll go on and on behalf of the Attorney General, Dana Nessel here, and we'll fight the rate increases or any other issues that are happening at the commission.
And let's talk about a little bit about the philosophy that we've had at the department, at least since 2019 when I came in. We get a lot of ratepayer requests from the utilities. What percentage of those do we fight?
Yeah, we fight all of the rate increases that have come in the state of Michigan. So since you've taken office, we've made it a point to go after every rate increase and make sure that those are reasonable requests and that we cut them down where we see unreasonable requests.
Okay, well, and you've done a fabulous job, as has our special lit division, of arguing these cases. But I think what is so frustrating for me is that the vast majority of Michigan residents, even those people who try to really keep updated on what's happening in the news, don't seem to understand who makes these decisions. So I frequently get people, well, mostly online, shouting at me like, why did you let, consumers get that rate increase? Or why did you let DTE get that rate increase? And it's hard because I want, well, sometimes to strangle some people, but I want people to know, like, that is not a decision for us to make. We can be advocates for the public and for ratepayers, but we don't make that decision. That decision is made by three people who sit on a commission, the Michigan Public Service Commission, all of whom are appointed by the governor in staggered terms. And, I think it's important to get that message out that it's very much the same as if, this was like the Court of Appeals or something. We can argue our case and we can point to the evidence, we can put on witnesses and experts and talk about why a rate increase should or shouldn't happen. And if so, what we think is appropriate, but we don't ultimately make that decision. It's made by the commission.
That's correct. That's some people don't understand, that you're an advocate, not the decision maker. And so that's
right. Exactly. So let's talk data centers, Michael, which is, I know, something that, you've had to deal with a lot in the last several months. And it's something new, or at least newer, because data centers are very much different than they have been in the past. And they are now these giant behemoth centers that artificial intelligence companies are setting up for things like, I don't know, making a fun video about your cat that combines like a human and a cat at once, or many other things, I suppose, that you could do. But, it's really driving up the energy needs in our state. And I wonder if you could speak to what you see happening in terms of what that will mean for the amount of energy that we need to be produced in order to make sure that we're all keeping warm in the winter and cold in the summer, or cool, I should say, and to make sure that our prices are affordable for the average ratepayer, the average resident or business.
Yep. On behalf of you, obviously, my division is going into these cases where the utility comes forward with a data center request or special contract, and we're making sure that none of the costs from those data centers are being passed on to other customers. And so this is the difficulty, again, because we're advocates. And, people talk about, like you said, oh, there's other data centers and, that's not a problem. The magnitude of a hyperscale data center we're talking is unheard of. In my 30 years with this office, you might have a Ford plant put in, or you might have a smaller data center put in somewhere else, but never do you have a customer come to you and say, I need 1.4 gigawatts. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's
it's not your
10
mother's
times.
data center is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. That's right. 10 times the size of the largest customer currently. So it's huge.
So one of the things that I think has upset us so much at the department is that over the course of these many decades and centuries that you've been working there, generally speaking, you get to, when I say have a say, you get to read these contracts from the utilities in full. And even if there is a non-disclosure agreement where you say, okay, we're not going to release commercially sensitive information, at least you get an opportunity to read it and to digest it, to have experts look at it, and to be able to present that to the commission in a contested hearing, which is much like a trial, like a bench trial would be, for instance. But this situation where for data centers, they're allowing these redacted contracts and these ex parte hearings. Can you explain, like, what is that and why is that happening?
Sure. So the normal process that you would see is a utility would come in and file a request, say like a rate increase request. Everyone's familiar with that. They would come in, and then parties such as yourself, other consumer advocates, large companies, even individual customers can file and say, I'm interested and I want to participate. Then the commission says, all right, they set up a schedule. It gives us time to come in and ask questions to the utility, file testimony about our concerns, do cross-examination of the utility, and file briefs to the commission before they make a decision. That's the normal process of contested case hearing. And in that process, yes, there is sometimes confidential information, but the parties sign the non-disclosure agreement. We all know, and we file things that are confidential to the commission, but all the parties get to see it. And it is normal. We always deal with this type of stuff. What's not normal is when they come to you and say, here's an application. You can't look at any of it, take a word for it, and we don't want to hear from you. That's unheard of.
Yeah, and I should say, I mean, since the time I know that I've been there since beginning of 2019, we've saved ratepayers some $4 billion or more in terms of requested increases by the utilities. Then you and your amazing team scour those filings, and oftentimes you find places where it's just totally inappropriate that the utility has thrown things in that they want the customer to pay for that we should never have to pay for. And I think one of the best examples of that, for instance, was, corporate jet travel.
That's right.
It's not good enough for DTE to have their executives fly and coach. They have to charter their own jet, and we
Yeah.
have to pay for it as the ratepayers. And so you've been very successful in getting those knocked down so that the commission later on says, yeah, we're not going to approve, rate increases for things like that. But with these secret contracts, I mean, we're not able to see that kind of stuff. So if
Yeah.
there is stuff in there that is objectionable, we can't even make that argument.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, people need to know that utilities have a different set of incentives than a normal customer does. A utility's incentive is to build and buy things because that's how they make money. They make 10% on every dollar of building and buying. Hence, they seek out opportunities to do this. Our job as an advocate is to go in and say, is there a cheap way to do it? Like instead of buying that luxury car, how about this economical one? It does the same thing and achieves the same purpose, but a lot cheaper for customers. And so in a case like this, yeah, they'll come in and say things and we look it over and then we give our argument. We can't in the data center one. There could be all kinds of things in those contracts that we just don't know and could hurt
And
us.
as I never tire of trying to tell people, why it's done this way, in this regulated process is because these companies are monopolies. There is no competition for them. You move into a certain house or apartment or condo or what have you, and your gas supplier, your electricity supplier, it's not up to you. It's already set by the location where you live. And so since we can't shop around and find the best rate, this commission is supposed to do that for us to make sure that we're only paying what is absolutely mandatory in order for, literally the lights to be able to stay on and for these energy providers to be able to stay in business. But what I think people don't know is that these companies, under at least the policies that have been established at this point, they get an automatic rate of return or a rate on equity in terms of the profits they make, no matter how much they're charging or how poor their service is. Is that right?
That's right. And it's been so frustrating because as you know, and the people in our state know, our electric reliability is usually, the bottom quartile in the nation. Yet we have some of the higher rates, at least in the region. And so you're wondering, wow, who does that? Who gets to make unheard of profits with poor performance? That's usually not how it works in the business world.
So what's the incentive of any of our utilities in Michigan? What's the incentive for them to provide good service to us if it doesn't matter? They get to make the same profit no matter how bad their service is.
It's tough. I mean, the commission's supposed to make that call, and we go in and make these arguments, and they would say, "Oh, well, we want to balance our shareholders and our customers," but when your customers can't leave you, who are they going to favor? That's our concern, is that they'll favor the shareholders over their customers because we can't leave. And when they make decisions like these special contracts, we're always concerned. We didn't write the contract, yet we're responsible for whatever they write in that contract. And then the gall to say, you can't look at the contract. Yeah.
So, Mike, here's one of my big concerns, and that is that, we're hearing for these data centers that basically they'll pay for themselves as time goes on because their energy needs will be so great that, the utilities will have to build out the infrastructure. It'll be better infrastructure. And as a result, it'll benefit all of us. But my great concern is if that's supposed to happen over a number of years, and I'm not talking 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, in some of these cases, they're 19-year contracts. So my concern is what happens if these data centers become obsolete in a few years because the technology improves. And I will say this, I just read an article on how Elon Musk has this grand idea that he's going to create these data centers that are going to be in space. So we won't need to have data centers that are operated on the ground in Michigan because they'll be operating, above our heads somewhere using solar power in space. So if that happens, so let's say that technology became available in 5 years. What would happen to us in Michigan if we have this 19-year agreement, for instance, on a 1.4 gigawatt data center?
Right. All those hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that we've invested to, build a distribution center, build the hookups to it and everything else, and to procure the power, we call it, for this data center. All of a sudden now, they don't need it anymore, or they go bankrupt. Maybe they can't compete anymore. Now you're left. What do I do with all this money? I was going to recover the cost over time, like you're saying, but now they've left. So you've got to make sure you have a locked, solid agreement that's going to lock those people in, and you need some kind of collateral that you can see, because just because you have an agreement that says, yeah, so-and-so was going to pay this kind of money if they leave, but you don't have the collateral, that means nothing to you then, right? Because the guy leaves.
Are these companies putting up collateral for these data centers here in Michigan now?
Not the DTE one that we're talking about here. It's a parent guarantee. Well, if the parent goes bankrupt, that's hardly a guarantee for us as customers who have to pay that cost. And then even if DTE says they'll backstop it, DTE can't afford billions of dollars. They would go bankrupt, and that would mean the customers have to bail them out.
I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today.
Yeah.
No one gets that because
that's right.
You have to be really old to know what we're talking about when I use that line. No one knows.
I know that line.
You do? Hooray!
Yeah, right.
Someone knows one of my obsolete references from like
I always use the
1970s.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I mean, we're always hearing about this AI bubble, right? And in fact, as we speak here today, while we're having this conversation, we're seeing some of the AI tech firms, their stock is tanking right now. Why is that? And are we on the precipice of a bubble? And what happens if the bubble pops and a lot of these AI firms that are doing business in Michigan go out of business in a few years?
Sure. So what's happening is they're investing tremendous amounts of money, taking out tremendous amounts of debt. So we call that, kind of over leverage the company on the hopes that, you'll get these things built, and then you'll be able to provide all these services to, like in the case of Oracle, they've got agreements with ChatGPT or whatever the groups are that they're building ahead of what they think is this boom, in AI needs. And so they're trying to get ahead of it to get that business. And what happens if that boom falls? What if there's a pop in the bubble like we've had before, right? We've had these in the past years, and we've seen them 2008 and other times where things just don't go. And if that happens, then we're stuck, like we were saying before, with the bill. And so you got to make sure those agreements are in there. You got to make sure that you were, locking those guys down, and they had put the money in there for in case of these circumstances. So I think you're right. I mean, this is too big. And you've always said it here, there's too big to fail. Right? The utility is too big. We rely upon energy. It runs everything in our life. And if they fail, well, our economy falls.
So essentially, that means if those firms go out of business, the AI tech firms, if they go out of business, it's not going to affect DTE's bottom line because they automatically get a certain profit anyway. And so to make up for the fact that those AI firms aren't going to be paying for it, who will pay for it?
Yeah, so we saw something like this in the past where Consumers Energy, what was in the early 80s, late 70s, where they built a nuclear plant, the Midland nuclear plant, or we're starting to build a nuclear plant. And then they got way over cost budget. And then, they had to shut it down because they were, going to go bankrupt. And they pled their case to the commission. Advocates such as, Frank Kelly back then said, hey, we never got any, it's not used and useful, we call it. We never got any use out of it. We're not paying for it. This was just your fault, overruns. Well, the commission said, well, we can't let Consumers Energy go bankrupt. So it ends up we fund their negligence essentially, or their inability to keep cost runs, in. And then the same problems could happen with the data centers because the more and more you have data centers growing, greater demand increases cost. So, they may project that it's going to cost us much to build that data center now and tell us, don't worry, there's affordability benefit. But if everyone's building data centers at the same time, there's a crunch on supply, which means labor costs go up, the cost to build it go up. Was it not factored in? We don't know. We can't ask those questions. So,
What about the availability of chips? I hear that's an issue as well.
Yeah, right. I mean, we've seen this before where the supply chain gets, kind of crunched because of too many, not enough to get in at a time. And all of a sudden the price tenfold up. We don't know.
Yeah. And as we said, it's not as though it's going to be, shouldered by the utilities, who again, like it's a no lose proposition for them because they're going to make their 9.8% rate of return on equity anyway. And ultimately, if it's not the ratepayers, it'll be the taxpayers because we'll have to bail out these companies because we can't let DTE or Consumers Energy go out of business because then who's going to provide us our energy and our electricity and our heat and our gas. I mean, it's really deeply concerning. And one of the things I was talking to your counterpart in Arizona about is that I think she used the term, that these are parasitic actors. And then I told her that I would borrow that phrase, but not give her credit. But I did just now give her credit, let it be known. And that her thought is like they're taking advantage of states like ours where we really haven't put good guardrails in place. And so it's like the wild, wild west. They're coming in here, and as many of them are coming as possible all at once at a time where we don't really know what impact it's going to have. We don't know what it's going to do to our rates. We don't know what it's going to do for environmental purposes, what it will mean for how much, whether there are polluting elements of it or whether we're going to have massive amounts of our water diverted for data centers. These are all substantial concerns. We don't know the answers to these questions.
Right.
And now for each of these data centers, the utilities are saying nobody gets a hearing for any of these. Yeah. Trust us, the three people who are looking at it, who are, gubernatorial appointees, just trust us. We know more than all of the rest of you. Don't look at what's behind Oz's curtain. Anything could happen, and likely will, but there's nothing that you, Department of Attorney General or consumer advocacy groups or, environmental groups or even the public gets to know about any of it. Just trust us.
That's right. Right. I mean, obviously, when you're looking at these data centers, you would think the two big things you want is a good transparent system of regulations so that people can see what's happening and understand and participate, which we don't seem to have with the data centers here. And two, you're going to want the guardrails So, and so they're telling us, oh, here, we put in guardrails, but we can't really see the guardrails. It's like at night, and you're not really seeing them. Maybe they don't have the reflective stuff on them, right? So you'll hear the commission say, "Well, we put guardrails in there, but we can't test them. We can't ask questions about them. We're not allowed to actually read the contract." It is a wild west here currently.
Yeah, and then the other concern being that, certain types of energy that the utilities themselves said we don't want to use fossil fuels for certain things. Like we don't want to have coal plants anymore because coal plants are so dangerous to the public because of the amount of pollutants that they emit and cause all kinds of respiratory diseases and whatnot. It's an unhealthy way to get your energy is through coal. Coal is by definition dirty. There's no such thing as clean coal. I don't care what the president says, but we have seen these same utilities that have said we're going to be shutting down those coal plants. And instead, we're in a situation where now we might need them because we might not be able to come up with any other way to ensure reliability of the grid to everybody because the energy needs have increased so substantially because of the data centers, not because of people, because of artificial intelligence needs.
That's right. I mean, it's amazing the amount of energy they need, and we're already facing a little bit with the coal plant that was being forced to run by Department of Energy, as you know, and we're challenging that right now. But there's real cost involved, not only environmentally, which we have talked about. There's actual EPA places you can go to type in, how many people will have asthma, from these amounts of pollution from this coal plant, and they'll tell you, how many people die over the time frame and stuff. And then on top of that, we just have the pure cost, which I know a lot of people are very interested in, is how much it affects their pocketbook. And we talk about, hey, running that coal plant, it's more expensive than some of the renewables. So why are we running it? That's why we had planned to shut it down, and now it's being forced to run, not because of not particularly this data center, but that same, hey, well, we see this, increase coming, and so we're going to force all these coal plants to run. And even the commissioner, right, they're faced now with looking at those integrated resource plans that we've talked about before, where we look 5, 10, 15 years down in the future. How much generation do we need? What kind of generation do we need? Well, if you're going to need the generation in 1 to 2 or 3 years, it's hard to meet that with building, because of building a generation plant or building even solar and wind, it takes time. And so then you're like, oh, well, I got to run that old coal plant maybe, so you're kind of worried about this.
Yeah. I want to mention this though, about the commission. Again, 3 people appointed by the governor in staggered terms. And what I've seen historically is that you have people who sort of cycle from and then again to the utilities that they are regulating. So you might have somebody who worked at consumers or worked at DTE, or were lobbyists for them or advocates for them or what have you. Then they get appointed to the commission. And then when their term is up, they go back to the utility, and they're the ones who are making the decisions oftentimes for the rest of us. Has that not been the case for your many, many years that you have been serving in the Department of Attorney General?
Yes, some have. And I mean, there are some protections. I think they have to wait 6 months under the statute, once they leave the commission to then, go to the utility if they want to. But you're right. I mean, that's a huge incentive, right? I mean, those utilities, or even it may be not that utility, but offshoots of the utility, that feed from that system. A lot of the commissioners will go there or become consultants essentially to these different organizations that are, benefited by the utilities. You're right. The system.
Some people might call that a conflict of interest.
That's right. I mean, and that's why, there are certain provisions in our statute that are supposed to protect against that, but it's always concerning. They don't receive money from the utilities directly, but like you said, the legislators and stuff do, and it's always concerning about what that impact will be when they write statutes.
Yeah, I do want to say this last thing that I think is concerning to me. And I know that you've been in elected office as a Republican, and as you know, I am a Democrat. But for the Attorney General, it is not an office that is selected by the voters for the purposes of a primary. It is instead done by convention. So it's the Republican, the Republican Party for Michigan, the Democratic Party for Michigan, making those selections at the convention. And I will say, just as a Democrat, who are the heavy hitters at the convention? Well, it's the trades, right? People who they're pipe fitters, they're iron workers, they are, carpenters. They're people who want to be able to go in and get these jobs and build as many data centers as possible. So they have a real incentive in supporting an attorney general candidate who wants these data centers, irrespective of whether it's a good deal for Michiganders in the future or not. And you certainly have in the general election, you have DTE and Consumers Energy are two of the very biggest donors in any race. They can literally bury people who run for state house or state senate, or even if they're running for governor or AG, can have a tremendous amount of influence. And then of course, you have the AI companies, which now have gotten involved in politics. And we saw with President Trump, I mean, who were the people who were standing there at his inauguration who were multi-million-dollar donors to him? You had Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, and people who are very, very much involved in AI. They're involved politically now too. So you have all these behemoths weighing in support of building as many data centers as possible with as few restrictions or guidelines as possible. And who's left on the other side? The ratepayers, right? And the just regular residents of states like ours who are going to get stuck with the tab and maybe some really detrimental consequences of all these data centers, but we don't have the money or power or influence of all of those different groups put together. And to me, that is deeply concerning.
Yeah, no, I appreciate of all the, what 5 AGs I've been working through. I mean, you have been the most aggressive in these areas to protect people's pocketbooks on these utility rates. And so I appreciate it as a, ratepayer myself. And, it's hard because you have to go out and kind of fight against, you're right, interests of some people, some, businesses or people make money from what the utility is doing, obviously. And sometimes that could be cross purposes with what you want to do and save money for customers. And they don't understand why we're there arguing these things. They're like, hey, you represent the people of the state of Michigan. So you're out there looking out for their pocketbook. And so that's the kind of argument we're making at the commission. Is like, hey, we got to see that contract. We need to verify those claims. We need to make sure that, the costs that you've included is not gold plating, as we call it, and that it's reasonable and it's prudent. We're not saying you can't, run the business and have a data center. Like you've always said, we got to make sure it's reasonable for the public. It's got to be affordable. I know you've said that a million times.
So I know we're wrapping up our time here, but I just want to say, Mike, you and your division and your team, when I came into office, I'm not going to lie, I was a little bit suspect, because you never know who you can trust on account of the deep state and all that. And I knew I wanted to be really aggressive in terms of protecting ratepayers. I had read Frank Kelly's book, and I knew how important it was to him, Frank Kelly, the people's lawyer. He does refer to himself in the third person a lot, but you get used to it. But that being the case, you have been so phenomenal. Your team and our special lit division have been incredible. You have done so much to protect ratepayers in this state. And I'm glad you get to be on a podcast where I can introduce you to the world, otherwise known as the 14 people who are going to listen to this. So they understand like the face behind the office that's doing all this work to try to protect people in this state. So thank you, Michael Moody, from the bottom of my heart. I know we have another, 11 months almost to, keep working together, but I've just been so proud of the work that you've done and the work that our team has done, and proud of those who, amazing attorneys and support staff that work at the Michigan Department of Attorney General. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'll allowing me. This is my first podcast, so thanks.
You were great. Well, that's going to do it for today's episode of Pantsuits and Lawsuits. AI is not really just some mystical concept in the future. It's part of our current reality, which means it deserves to be taken very seriously. Now, we have the opportunity, while this industry is still in its infancy, to set out proper guardrails that will protect our communities from all the potential harm that's out there. But if we don't act now, we're going to miss that window. So thanks for tuning in. You can learn more about the work of our department by following us on social media or visiting our website. See you next time.